ghosts, ghouls, and things that go bump in the night. You know, when I was young, I did a variety of odd jobs, but my favorite was always house sitting, especially if the house sitting involved pets. Thankfully, I never had an experience similar to the story that I have for you today. So, why don't you take a seat, hang out for a bit, and hear the story I answered the ad. I saw the ad in the newspaper and knew it was just what I was looking for. I'm pretty sure that everyone at one time or another has heard the old cliche about the broke college kid. Well, it's true. I was home for the summer and desperate for some cash, and here was the perfect opportunity to earn some. House sitter wanted for the next week, read the heading. I quickly browsed the rest of the ad for the pertinent info, and once I had it, called the given phone number. "Hello?" A female voice greeted me from the other end of the phone. "Yes, ma'am," I replied confidently. "My name is Sierra, and I was calling in reference to the ad you posted in the paper. The house sitter gig?" "Oh, yes," the woman said enthusiastically. "You're quick. It barely posted today. Are you interested?" "Definitely," I replied assertively. "I'm home from college and could use the extra money." "That's great," the woman said. "Let me give you the address. Do you have something to write with?" Retrieving a notebook and a pen, I took down the woman's address. Half an hour later, I pulled my worn-out Honda Civic up to the curb in front of the house. It was an older-style home with a big front porch. You know, the kind you picture grandparents with their rocking chairs sitting on. I got out of the car, proceeding up the walk-in front steps, and then rang the doorbell. Directly, the door opened, revealing a 30-ish blonde woman in business attire. "You must be Sierra," she stated. "I am," I said perkily. "Well, come in," the woman said cheerily. "I'm Celeste." I followed Celeste through the door, immediately taking in the warm coziness of the old house. The woman must have been an old soul, because the place felt more widowed grandmother than young business professional. Lace doilies covered most of the surfaces, needlepoint stitch pictures adorned the walls, and houseplants occupied a good bit of space in the living room. "It's very homey," I said, trying not to sound sarcastic. "It is, isn't it?" Celeste replied. "It was my grandmother's house. I inherited it after she passed away, and I've never had the heart to change things. Besides, I think it fits the place just right." I nodded in agreement as I continued to survey the room. Celeste showed me around the rest of the house, alternating between telling me about my expected duties and how nice and quiet the neighborhood was. "You should have no trouble," she said, "other than maybe a little boredom." "I think I'll be all right," I said with a smile. "After the hell of finals, I could use some peace and quiet." "You'll have plenty of that," Celeste said, laughing. "Now, like I told you before, I'm leaving Friday morning, but there'll be an extra key under the mat at the back door, and I'll leave a number where I can be reached on the kitchen counter by the phone. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." I assured her I would, and then thanked her for the opportunity before heading back home. By Friday afternoon, as I drove to Celeste's house, I decided I was more than looking forward to the upcoming week. It was going to be like having my own place, even if it was decorated in 20th century old lady. I found the keys she left for me, let myself in, then settled on the couch in front of the TV. The rest of that day and the next were pretty uneventful. I watched TV, made myself food, and even sat out on the front porch with a book. But by the end of the weekend, the boredom Celeste had mentioned was beginning to set in. How did people do it? I was so used to the busy bustle of college life that I was starting to feel restless with my peaceful surroundings. After some careful deliberation, I decided I would make myself an early dinner, then go for a Sunday evening stroll around the neighborhood. Who knows, maybe I would meet some interesting neighbors with attractive, available sons. I went to the kitchen and picked out a box of hamburger helper. The meat was just starting to brown when I heard the noise. It sounded like a muffled voice, and it came from below the kitchen floor. As far as I knew, there was nothing under the house but pipes and bare ground. And I was pretty sure if the house had a cellar or basement, Celeste would have mentioned it. Eventually, I decided it had to be the pipes or something. It was, after all, an old house, and old houses tend to make old house noises, or so I've heard. Putting it out of my mind, I finished cooking dinner, ate, and then took my walk. It really was a quiet neighborhood, so while it was good to get out of the house for a bit, there was unfortunately no fun to be found. I ended up back on the couch afterwards, watching an old movie on HBO. The next day, I locked up and went to the mall where I ran into my friend Tracy. Because we both went to different colleges, it had been a good while since we had seen one another. I decided to make good use of the unexpected reunion. I told her about the house-sitting job and asked her if she wanted to come over to Celeste's later and keep me company. Luckily, she was all for the idea. Her parents and younger brother were driving her crazy, and a change of scenery was just what she needed. She arrived at the house about 5, and we spent the first part of the evening catching up and talking guys. Apparently, Tracy had met her share of Mr. Wrongs and Mr. Right Nows, but had not yet to find a single Mr. Right. I had had similar luck myself and told her as much. "Doesn't it give you the creeps?" she asked after a while, changing the subject. "What's that?" I asked curiously. "All of this," she said with a flourish of her hands. "It's like being at my grandma's house." I grinned. "It's really not that bad," I said, trying not to laugh. "Besides, Celeste is super nice. She's just a little sentimental." "Sentimental?" Tracy exclaimed. "I couldn't spend a night here, much less a whole week." I loved Tracy to death, but she'd never been one for old-fashioned things. "What can I say? It's a job," I told her. "I'm getting paid to be here, so I might as well deal with it." "Screw that," she scoffed with good humor. "I can literally feel myself becoming an old maid just sitting here." We both bust out laughing. "You're terrible," I told her breathlessly between peals of laughter. "No, I just know good taste," said Tracy factually, "and this is not it." I rolled my eyes at her. It wasn't my place to judge Celeste's choice in home decor, especially when I was getting paid to spend a week looking at it, but I would never admit to Tracy that I agreed with what she was saying, so I nonchalantly changed the subject. My friend was gracious enough to get the hint. Tracy stayed till close to midnight and then declared she'd spent enough time at the old folks' home for one night and took her leave. After she left, the silence descended on me like a storm cloud. I cleaned up, watched TV for a little bit, and then went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, thirsty as all get out. Walking into the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water. That's when I heard the noise again, but this time it was followed by a loud bang. "What on earth was that?" I asked the empty kitchen with a start. With a shaky hand, I placed the glass on the counter before I could drop and break it. Once again, it seemed like the sound was coming from under the kitchen floor somewhere, but I never could pinpoint the exact source. In the end, I just rationalized the best I could. An animal must have dug under the house, and when the pipes made their weird noise, it was startled and ran into something. I would check it out in the morning. But when I got up and went to check the perimeter of the house, I found no sign of anything digging to get underneath it. I chalked it up to more old house noises. Maybe Celeste was so used to them she just forgot to mention it to me. I should call and ask her about it. I said to myself. But I didn't want to look like an idiot who was freaking out over some random sounds, so I talked myself out of calling. I would just ignore it, and Friday would come soon enough. I didn't hear the strange noises for a couple of days after that, and by Thursday I had almost succeeded in forgetting about it. That evening, I found myself back in the kitchen and was sticking a Red Baron pizza in the oven when I was forcibly reminded of the noise. This time, the muffled sound was followed by more loud bangs. There was no way it was the pipes or a random animal. I had been lying to myself. These noises sounded like there was intelligence behind them. Could the house be haunted? That idea definitely didn't help my state of mind. I had to get to the bottom of things before I went crazy. I began to frantically search the kitchen, and when I still found nothing to give me even a hint of a clue, I went to the backyard and searched there along the side of the house. The banging continued the whole time, but I couldn't find any sign of what was causing it. I decided I'd had enough. There was no way I was going to stay in a haunted house, if that was the case, so I went back inside, determined to pack up my things and leave. I had just come back into the kitchen door when I noticed something odd about the china cabinet. There was something gleaming along one side. I walked over to take a better look, wishing for the love of God that the banging would stop. There were hinges. The china cabinet was a secret door. I had seen enough horror movies to know nothing good was ever found behind a secret door, especially when strange noises were involved. But I just had to know. I began removing china by the handfuls, and when the cabinet was empty, I found what I was looking for. Hidden behind a stack of plates was a small, recessed button. It blended in with the back of the cabinet wall almost perfectly. With a shuddering hand, I reached out and pushed the button. There was a small click, and then the cabinet swung away from the wall, revealing a heavy-looking metal door. This second door was held closed by a simple sliding bolt, which I stared at for a good minute before making my decision. Sliding the bolt back, I pushed the door open. A flight of stairs descended down from the other side. Feeling around with a tentative hand, I found the light switch and flipped it. The basement below was flooded with light, and with it came incessant, muffled screaming and banging. Slowly, I went down the stairs, while asking myself just what the hell I was getting into. At the bottom, I took a good long look at the scene before me. The basement looked like any other basement in any other old house, except for the teenage girl chained up in the corner. The girl looked a couple years older than myself, and her wrists and ankles were bound with padlocks and chains to a heavy loop set into the wall. There was just enough slack in those bonds to allow the girl to get to her only source of nourishment, an automatic dog waterer, but it was obvious from her emancipated appearance that it had been a while since she had last eaten. For a good minute, I couldn't help but stand there staring as the girl looked wearily back at me. "Help me," she said to me in a cracked whisper. It was barely audible, but enough to rouse me from my shock. I ran to her with the hopes of freeing her, but it was no use. There was no telling where the keys to the locks were, and it would take forever to find them even if they were in the house, which they most likely were not. Something told me Celeste had them with her. "I'm going back upstairs to call the police," I assured her. "I'll be back as soon as I'm done. Can you eat?" She slowly nodded. "Good. Hang on and I'll be right back." Taking the stairs two at a time, I raced back up to the kitchen and grabbed the phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. "911, what is your emergency?" a composed female voice answered. I related my story as calmly as I could, and afterwards the woman assured me help was on the way. Once she'd hung up, I grabbed a plate, loaded it with my pizza, and filled up a glass with some fresh water. When I returned with the food and water, the girl took it from me greedily. After a couple of minutes, she was able to tell me her story, in between bites and gulps. The girl's name was Janie, and Celeste had taken her and another girl, Leslie, from a mall in a neighboring town. Apparently, she had spent months getting to know the girls through their church youth group before inviting them over to the house for a Bible study. The drugs were in the refreshments, Jamie told me with a strained voice. The next thing we knew, we were down here. I was chained up here, and the old lady was about to kill Leslie. I looked at Janie, confused. Old lady? Celeste is young, I told her. Maybe in her 30s. Janie shook her head. She was old, until she killed Leslie anyway. She bathed in my friend's blood, and it made her young. I stared at her in disbelief. Then things began to make sense. The old-fashioned decor in the house, it wasn't Celeste's grandmother's stuff. It was hers. Janie finished eating and drinking as I sat watching in silence. The whole thing was too much, and I was grateful when I could hear the sirens. Shortly, the police and the fire department arrived. The officers took my statements while the EMTs tended to Janie. I knew there were some things about the story that they would find unbelievable, so I left them out. When my part was finished, I collected my things and went home. For the next few days, I watched the newspaper waiting to see if there was any mention of Celeste's capture. Finally, on Monday morning there was. 60-year-old woman arrested in connection with the disappearance of 2 teenage girls. Reading through the rest of the story, I couldn't help but take note of the way Janie was labeled as confused due to the inconsistencies she gave of Celeste's description. But as I looked at the picture of the older woman at the bottom of the article, I knew Janie hadn't been confused by any means. The picture was definitely Celeste. People would kill for that beauty treatment, I thought to myself, while closing the paper with a chill. I think I'll just stick to face cream. And that, lovely listeners, is why you don't answer classified ads in the newspaper. If you're the type of person that's brave enough to do that, I commend you. If you have a story like this, you should send it to me at hauntedhorrorstorian@gmail.com or find me on Facebook at Haunted Horrorstorian Podcast. That's all I have for today, listeners. Until next time, stay away from strange houses, and remember, sometimes it's more than just a story.